In June of 1812, the largest army ever assembled in European history, 685,000 men from 20 nations, crossed the Neman River into Russia. 6 months later, fewer than 40,000 stumbled back. According to Napoleon's own 29th Bulletin, published December 3, 1812, the Emperor's health has never been better. 500,000 families across Europe mourned their dead. Think about those numbers. 685,000 to 40,000, a 94% casualty rate. Contemporary Russian and French sources agree this wasn't a military defeat. It was the annihilation of an empire's manpower. Modern DNA analysis of mass graves in Vilnius reveals the pathogens that killed more soldiers than all of Napoleon's enemies combined. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented logistical failures, disease, and one man's refusal to accept reality transformed a campaign of conquest into history's most famous military disaster. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that changed the course of European history. First, the engineering decision that Napoleon ordered destroyed, and the general who disobeyed and saved the army's remnant. Second, the medical condition documented by Napoleon's own physicians that clouded his judgment at the bloodiest single-day battle of his career. Third, the 400 men who waded into sub-zero water knowing most would die, and why only a handful survived. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did an emperor who had conquered from Madrid to Moscow lose half his army before fighting a single major battle? What logistical failure, documented in supply depot records, meant horses were dying by the thousands before the first shot was fired? Why did Napoleon remain in Moscow's burning ruins for 5 weeks when every military advisor begged him to retreat? And how did 400 Dutch and French engineers, working in water that killed in 30 minutes, build 2 bridges that allowed Napoleon himself to escape, while 10,000 stragglers were abandoned to the Russians? To understand how the impossible became inevitable, we need to step back to July 7th, 1807, when 2 emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Neman River and divided Europe between them. On July 7th, 1807, 2 emperors met on a raft anchored in the middle of the Neman River. Napoleon Bonaparte and Tsar Alexander I signed a treaty that ostensibly divided Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. Neither man intended to honor it. The treaties of Tilsit, as they became known, were diplomatic theater designed to humiliate Prussia. Under the treaty's terms, Prussia was reduced from 89,120 square miles to 46,032 square miles, half its territory gone. The kingdom that had challenged Napoleon was carved apart to create satellite states. The Duchy of Warsaw, the Kingdom of Westphalia, territories handed to Russia and Saxony. Prussia's army was limited to 40,000 men. The tribute demanded 154,500,000 francs. But the treaty's most consequential provision was Russia's agreement to join the continental system. Napoleon's massive economic blockade designed to strangle British trade. The Berlin Decree of November 21, 1806, and the Milan Decree of December 17, 1807, had closed ports from Norway to Naples to British commerce. Russia's participation would complete the blockade. For the Russian nobility, the continental system was economic catastrophe. Russia's economy depended on exporting timber, hemp, and grain to Britain. The blockade cut off the Russian elite from their primary source of wealth. Noble estates hemorrhaged money. Resentment festered. Napoleon viewed the alliance as a tool to dominate Europe. Alexander saw it as a temporary accommodation to rebuild Russian strength. The personal relationship between the emperors, warm at Tilsit, deteriorated rapidly. Napoleon's annexation of the Duchy of Oldenburg, territory belonging to Alexander's brother-in-law, was viewed as a direct insult. When Napoleon sought to marry Alexander's sister Catherine, the Tsar arranged her marriage to the King of Württemberg instead. The younger sister Anna, Alexander's mother, considered Napoleon and his revolutionary origins pure evil. Another rejection. By 1810, the tensions had become unsustainable. On December 31st, 1810, Tsar Alexander I formally withdrew Russia from the continental system. He issued an edict allowing neutral ships to land in Russian ports, ships that would inevitably carry British goods. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence reveals that Napoleon didn't just view this as a policy disagreement. He saw it as personal betrayal and an existential threat to the entire economic strategy that sustained French hegemony. When Alexander signed his name withdrawing from the continental system, he didn't just break an economic agreement. He lit the fuse on the largest military mobilization in human history. Napoleon's response would be unprecedented in scale and ambition. Napoleon organized the Grande Armée of 685,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled in European history to that point. Only about 300,000 were French. This was an empire on the march, and every subject people would contribute their sons. The multinational composition of the army revealed both the extent of Napoleon's power and its fundamental weakness. According to French military records preserved in the invasion order of battle, the breakdown was staggering. Between 300,000 and 410,000 ethnic Frenchmen, 95,000 to 108,000 Poles, approximately 110,000 soldiers from the Rhine Confederation German states, 34,000 Austrians, 20,000 Prussians, 27,000 to 30,000 Italians, 15,000 Swiss, plus contingents of Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and Croatians. The motivations varied wildly across this multinational force. The Poles were the most committed. They viewed the campaign as the Second Polish War that would restore their national sovereignty. Every Polish soldier marched east, believing Napoleon would resurrect an independent Poland from the territories Russia, Prussia, and Austria had carved apart. The Austrians and Prussians? Reluctant allies forced into service by previous defeats and coerced treaties. Their loyalty was suspect from day one. Prussia's 20,000 soldiers had been defeated and humiliated at Jena. Austria's 34,000 had been crushed at Wagram. They marched because they had no choice. The logistical preparation seemed meticulous. Napoleon had established massive supply magazines at strategic points: Danzig, Breslau, Thorn, Vilna, Minsk. Danzig alone was stocked with enough provisions to feed 400,000 men for nearly 2 months. Vilna held 27,000 muskets, 30,000 pairs of shoes, vast quantities of brandy. The maps were drawn with precision, the routes calculated. The Corps organized into self-contained mini-armies of 10,000 to 50,000 men each, capable of independent operation, but designed to work in concert. Marshal Louis-Alexandre Berthier commanded as Chief of Staff. Under him, the great marshals of the empire led the Corps. Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout commanded the First Corps, Marshal Nicolas Oudinot II, Marshal Michel Ney III, Marshal Joachim Murat, the reserve cavalry. Polish troops under Prince Józef Poniatowski formed the Fifth Corps. Each marshal was a veteran of Napoleon's greatest victories: Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, Friedland. The standard French infantryman carried approximately 30 kilograms, 66 pounds, of equipment. The Charleville Model 1777 musket, a 69 caliber flintlock smoothbore weapon, 60 inches long, weighed 9 pounds with its 15-inch bayonet attached, chainmail worn over thick furs, a knapsack with rations for 4 days of bread, 2 days of meat, water bottle, spare boots, personal kit, the weight of empire on every soldier's back. But Napoleon had made a fatal decision, documented in multiple campaign records. He forbade tents and camping gear for the infantry. The reasoning was speed. Lighter loads meant faster marches. Faster marches meant catching and destroying the Russian armies before they could retreat into the vast interior. It was mathematical logic that ignored human biology and Russian weather. The soldiers would sleep exposed to the elements every night. In summer, this meant heat exhaustion. In winter, it would mean death. The magazines were stocked. The maps were drawn. The corps organized with mathematical precision. The standard pattern wagons, heavy, well-built, designed for Western European roads, were loaded with supplies. Napoleon had thought of everything, except the roads. Except what happens when those heavy wagons, perfectly functional in France and Germany, encountered the primitive dirt tracks of rural Russia. Except what the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, would do to an army that needed to move fast. While Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, Russia prepared the oldest weapon in military history: space itself. General Michael Andreas Barclay de Tolly recognized a mathematical reality. The Russian field forces, between 180,000 and 220,000 men, scattered across 3 separate armies, were no match for Napoleon's 600,000 in open battle. So he did the one thing that looked like treason to his own people. He retreated. Barclay commanded the First Western Army. General Pyotr Bagration led the Second Western Army. General Alexander Tormasov commanded the Third Army in the south. Together, they fielded approximately 938 artillery pieces and a mixture of regular army troops, irregular Cossacks, and hastily assembled militia. Against them, the greatest military machine ever assembled, commanded by a general who had crushed every army that dared face him in the field. Barclay's strategy was pure Fabian warfare, named for the Roman general who had defeated Hannibal by refusing battle. Trade space for time. Draw the invaders deeper into the Russian interior. Force them to extend supply lines across hostile territory. Implement scorched earth. Burn crops, destroy bridges, evacuate livestock. Poison wells. Deny the enemy food, shelter, forage. Make Russia itself the enemy. Contemporary Russian accounts document the fury this strategy generated among the nobility and common soldiers. Barclay was of Baltic German descent with Scottish roots. In Russian eyes, a foreigner. As the army retreated and retreated, abandoning Russian soil without a fight, suspicion grew. Was he a coward? Was he a traitor secretly working for Napoleon? The whispers became shouts. When Smolensk fell in mid-August, one of Russia's holy cities, its walls dating to the 16th century, the political pressure on Tsar Alexander I became unbearable. But it wasn't just military strategy. The Orthodox Church transformed the invasion into a holy war. Priests declared this a defense of the motherland against the devils of the French Revolution, against the Antichrist Napoleon, who had imprisoned the Pope and spread godless revolutionary ideology across Catholic Europe. This was Mother Russia defending herself against Western corruption. Russian peasants, motivated by religious fervor and hatred of the invaders, burned their own crops and fled into the forests. They formed guerrilla bands, partisans who would harass French supply lines, murder stragglers, deny the invaders even the ability to forage safely. On August 17, 1812, Alexander replaced Barclay with General Mikhail Kutuzov, as commander-in-chief. Kutuzov, 67 years old, a veteran of Austerlitz, embodied everything Russian. Orthodox, traditional, beloved by the common soldiers. He had one eye. He'd lost the other to a Turkish bullet decades earlier. His appointment was supposed to signal the end of retreat and the beginning of resistance. Paradoxically, while appointed to stop the retreat, Kutuzov continued Barclay's strategy because it was working. He recognized what historians would later call the logic inherent in Russia's terrain and weather. The vastness of Russia itself was Russia's greatest weapon. Space could defeat Napoleon where soldiers could not. But Kutuzov also understood Russian psychology. The army needed a battle. The people needed blood. He would give them one, but on ground of his choosing, where the French would have to attack prepared positions and pay in blood for every meter. The Orthodox Church declared this a holy war. Russian peasants and Cossacks would fight with religious fervor, transforming a conventional campaign into total war where the French were denied even the ability to forage safely. As the Russians withdrew, burning everything behind them, Napoleon's army marched into a hostile void. The myth says Russian winter destroyed Napoleon's army. The truth, documented in contemporary campaign records and modern historical analysis. By the time the Grande Armée reached Smolensk in August, it had already lost half its effective strength. And it wasn't winter, it was summer. The crossing of the Neman River began on the night of June 24th, 1812. 685,000 men moving in 5 massive columns across a river that marked the border between the Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire. The initial advance was rapid. Napoleon's trademark forced marches, covering 30 kilometers per day, sometimes more. The goal was to catch and destroy the separated Russian armies before they could unite. Speed was everything. But the June and July heat in western Russia was intense. Temperatures exceeded 30 degrees Celsius. The dirt tracks, you couldn't call them roads, sent up clouds of choking dust. Soldiers, carrying 30 kilograms of equipment, began dropping from heat exhaustion. The forbidden tents meant no shade, no relief. Contemporary accounts from officers' diaries describe finding soldiers collapsed beside the road, dead from heat stroke before they'd fired a shot. Then came the diseases. Modern forensic and genomic studies of mass graves in Vilnius have revealed the killers. Rickettsia prowazeki, the bacterium that causes typhus, transmitted by body lice in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Salmonella enterica paratyphi C, causing paratyphoid fever. Borrelia recurrentis, causing relapsing fever. Bartonella quintana, causing trench fever. All spread by lice. All devastating to soldiers already weakened by heat, exhaustion, and contaminated water. The typhus outbreaks began even before the invasion commenced. Soldiers crowded into staging areas near the Neman picked up lice. The lice spread the bacteria. Within weeks, men were dying by the hundreds from high fever, delirium, and organ failure. One French surgeon documented that typhus decimated the ranks before a single major battle was fought. But the most catastrophic loss was the horses. Within the first 8 weeks, tens of thousands of cavalry and artillery horses died. The problem was simple and fatal. Instead of dry oats and hay, which the supply system failed to deliver in sufficient quantities, the horses were forced to eat green, wet grass from the Russian marshes and fields. This led to fatal colic and dysentery. A horse with colic would writhe in agony, its intestines twisted. Death followed within hours. Without horses, the cavalry became all afoot, useless for reconnaissance, for pursuit, for the shock charges that had won Napoleon's greatest victories. Without draft horses, Artillery pieces and ammunition wagons had to be abandoned. Hundreds of cannon left beside the road. The army's firepower diminished with every kilometer. The water situation was equally catastrophic. Russia's western regions were sparsely populated. Villages were separated by vast distances. Wells were few. The Russian scorched earth policy meant those wells that existed were often poisoned or filled with debris. Soldiers drank from stagnant pools and contaminated streams. Dysentery spread. Men marched while suffering from severe diarrhea, dehydration sapping their strength. Napoleon's marshals recognized the disaster unfolding. When the army reached Smolensk on August 13th, they found a city the Russians had fought to defend for 5 days before withdrawing and burning it. The marshals urged Napoleon to halt. Winter in Smolensk. Rebuild strength. Resume the campaign in spring with fresh supplies and reinforcements. The army that had crossed the Neman, 685,000 strong, was now perhaps 350,000 effectives. Half gone. No major battle fought. Napoleon refused. He was obsessed, contemporary accounts suggest, with achieving a decisive victory. The kind of crushing battlefield triumph that had forced the Austrians, Prussians, and Russians to the peace table after Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. He believed he would find that victory in Moscow, the ancient capital, the spiritual heart of Russia. Take Moscow, and Alexander would have to negotiate. The decision transformed a difficult campaign into a death sentence. 110 kilometers west of Moscow, near the village of Borodino, Kutuzov finally halted his retreat. He would give Napoleon the decisive battle he demanded. And it would be the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Tolstoy, drawing from contemporary witness accounts for his novel War and Peace, describes Napoleon on the eve of Borodino. Face puffy and yellow, body developing a paunch, eyes less piercing than in his prime. This wasn't literary embellishment. It was medical observation that would cost thousands of lives. Medical historians analyzing contemporary physicians' records have documented Napoleon's condition at Borodino with disturbing precision. He suffered from severe dysuria, painful urination. According to accounts from officers close to him, his quote 7. He experienced what doctors described as quote 8, fever accompanied by violent shaking, indicating a serious urinary tract infection. His legs were swollen with edema. He had a severe cough and throat problems. Multiple witnesses recorded that he complained he quote, _9, __. The likely causes, medical historians suggest, were chronic conditions Napoleon had suffered for years. A urethral stricture, possibly from gonococcal urethritis, gonorrhea contracted from his first wife, Josephine, who was believed to have had the infection before their marriage, schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection contracted during the Egypt campaign of 1798. The flatworm Schistosoma hematobium was endemic in Egypt, known to cause chronic bladder inflammation, painful urination, and bladder stones. Contemporary accounts describe Napoleon's behavior at Borodino as passive, even lethargic. He sat for long periods in what observers called a semi-trance. His speech was slower than usual. He took longer to make decisions. Officers reported he seemed more interested in nursing his cold than in taking an active part in the unfolding battle. This was not the Napoleon of Austerlitz, who had ridden along the lines, timing every maneuver with precision, sensing every shift in the battle's momentum. The tactical impact was devastating. Despite urgent pleas from Marshal Michel Ney and Marshal Joachim Murat, his most aggressive commanders, Napoleon refused to commit the 30,000-man Imperial Guard. These were the elite of the elite. The Guard had never been defeated. A full Guard assault against the buckling Russian center might have shattered Kutuzov's army completely, turned tactical victory into strategic annihilation. Marshal Ney reportedly begged for permission. Napoleon, sitting on his camp chair, refused. Historians have debated his reasoning for 2 centuries. Was he preserving the Guard to secure his own retreat? Did he doubt his ability to replace these veteran troops? Was his judgment clouded by illness and pain? Medical historians analyzing his symptoms suggest the illness may have affected his decision-making capacity, though direct causation cannot be proven. What we know with certainty: by withholding the Guard, Napoleon allowed the Russian army to survive as a fighting entity. Kutuzov withdrew his forces in good order. They would rebuild. They would fight again. Napoleon technically won at Borodino. The road to Moscow lay open. But by failing to commit the Imperial Guard, by fighting with uncharacteristic passivity, he ensured that this victory would become the first step toward catastrophic defeat. A week after the battle, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected to find supplies, shelter, and a delegation from the Tsar offering surrender. He found none of these things. On September 7, 1812, approximately 250,000 soldiers met in massive confrontation 110 kilometers west of Moscow. By sunset, over 75,000 lay dead or wounded. It was the bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Kutuzov had chosen defensive ground that blocked both the old and new Smolensk roads leading to Moscow. The Russian line was anchored by massive earthwork fortifications. The Bagration flèches on the left, 3 V-shaped redoubts named for Prince Pyotr Bagration, and the Raevsky Redoubt, known as the Great Redoubt, in the center. These weren't mere trenches. They were fortress-like positions with walls of packed earth reinforced with timber, protecting artillery batteries and infantry firing positions. The French deployed approximately 130,000 men and 587 artillery pieces. The Russians fielded about 120,000 regulars, plus 43,000 irregulars and militia. With 637 guns, military historians emphasize that Napoleon possessed only marginal numerical superiority. This would not be a battle won by overwhelming numbers. Napoleon's tactical approach was, multiple historians note, uncharacteristically simplistic. Instead of his signature outflanking maneuvers, the brilliant strategic moves that had won Austerlitz and Jena, he opted for direct frontal assaults against prepared Russian entrenchments. Marshal Davout proposed a flanking movement around the Russian left. Napoleon rejected it. He wanted a straightforward, crushing victory. Artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault. Hammer the Russian positions until they broke. The result was murderous. The battle began at 6 in the morning with a massive French artillery barrage. The sound, witnesses reported, could be heard 40 kilometers away. The ground shook. Then came the infantry assaults. Wave after wave of French soldiers charged the Bagration flèches and the Raevsky Redoubt. The Russians met them with canister shot at point-blank range. Artillery shells filled with metal balls that turned cannon into giant shotguns. Contemporary accounts describe the cannonballs skipping through packed ranks like murderous bowling balls, each impact sending up sprays of blood, bone fragments, limbs. The Raevsky Redoubt changed hands multiple times. French soldiers would storm the earthworks, bayonets fixed, climbing over their own dead to reach the top. Hand-to-hand combat with Russian defenders, muskets used as clubs. Bayonets thrust into bodies at arm's length. Then Russian counterattacks would drive the French back down the slope. Then another French assault. The redoubt became, in the words of one French officer, quote, 14 The casualty toll among the officer corps was staggering. The French lost between 49 and 50 generals killed or wounded in a single day. The Russians lost 29 generals. When generals die in such numbers, it means they're fighting in the front ranks, leading desperate charges, refusing to retreat. It means the killing is happening at close range, where musket balls and canister shot make no distinction between private and prince. By late afternoon, the French had taken the redoubts. The Russians began withdrawing from the field. But it wasn't a rout. Kutuzov maintained cohesion. His army retreated in formation, artillery covering the withdrawal. They had lost between 44,000 and 47,000 men, about 1/3 of their engaged force. The French had lost between 28,000 and 35,000, about 1/5 of their force. Both armies had bled so intensely that neither would recover their full strength. Napoleon claimed victory. The road to Moscow lay open, but the Russian army had survived, retreating in good order, ready to rebuild. And both sides had suffered casualties that exceeded most of Napoleon's previous battles combined. Military historians call Borodino a Pyrrhic victory, won at such terrible cost that it crippled the victor. For Napoleon, it was a triumph that led directly to catastrophe. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting to find a functioning capital and a delegation offering peace. Instead, he found a city of ashes. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th, 1812, expecting to find supplies, shelter, and a Russian delegation offering surrender terms. He found a city emptied of 250,000 inhabitants. Only 2 to 3% of the population remained. The elderly too frail to flee, the sick, the destitute too poor to escape. That night, fires began erupting across the city. Kutuzov had made his decision at the Council of Filii, a documented meeting of Russian commanders on September 13th. He prioritized preservation of the army over defense of the city. Moscow, he recognized, would become a sponge that would suck in the French army and destroy it through attrition, disease, and the approaching winter. The decision was agonizing. Abandoning Russia's ancient capital, the spiritual heart of the nation, but strategically sound. The fire was not accidental. Governor General Count Fyodor Rostopchin had prepared Moscow as a trap. Contemporary Russian and French accounts agree. Rostopchin ordered the release of convicts from the prisons and the removal of the city's fire engines. The intent was clear. On the night of September 14th, flames appeared in multiple districts simultaneously. By September 15th, a massive conflagration had overtaken the city. The wind spread the fire from wooden building to wooden building. Moscow, constructed primarily of timber, burned like tinder. The statistics of destruction are documented in Russian records compiled after the French retreat. 6,496 residential buildings out of 9,151 reduced to ash. 122 churches destroyed. 3/4 of Moscow's structures gone. The Kremlin survived. Its stone construction resisted the flames, but everything around it was blackened ruin. For Napoleon, the psychological impact was profound. Contemporary French accounts describe his horror at the _17_ to destroy their own most sacred city rather than surrender it intact. This wasn't the calculated pragmatism of European warfare. This was something else. Total war driven by nationalistic and religious fury. Napoleon had expected Alexander to behave like Francis of Austria or Frederick William of Prussia. Lose a battle, lose your capital, sue for peace. Alexander wasn't playing by those rules. Napoleon occupied the ruins for 35 days. He waited for a peace delegation that would never come. He sent 3 separate peace proposals to Alexander, carried by envoys who traveled the dangerous roads to St. Petersburg. The Tsar refused to respond. His advisors counseled patience. The French army was trapped in a burned city with winter approaching. Why negotiate when time itself would destroy them? The logistical impact was catastrophic. The fire destroyed the food, fodder, and clothing Napoleon had hoped would sustain his army through the winter. The magazines his quartermasters had expected to seize, gone. The shelter for his troops, gone. The French soldiers occupied the Kremlin and stone buildings that had survived. But 100,000 men cannot fit into such limited space. Most bivouacked in the ruins, exposed to increasingly cold September nights. By early October, Napoleon's marshals were unanimous. Retreat, immediately, before winter arrives. Before the Russian armies regroup and cut the roads west. Marshal Berthier, his chief of staff, documented these discussions. Napoleon vacillated. He still believed Alexander would negotiate. He still believed the occupation of Moscow meant something strategically. When Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat on October 19th, the first snow had already fallen. The temperature was dropping. The Grande Armée, reduced to about 100,000 effectives, would have to march 500 miles through a country it had already stripped bare during the advance, with the Russian army stalking every step. The retreat from Moscow began as an orderly withdrawal. Within weeks, it would become a descent into hell. The retreat from Moscow began as an orderly withdrawal on October 19th, 1812. Napoleon initially attempted strategy over simple retreat. He would take the southern route via the Kaluga Road, seeking unplundered territory where the army could find food and forage. The northern Smolensk highway, used during the advance, had been stripped bare. The southern route offered hope. On October 24th, at the town of Maloyaros-Lavits, that hope died. Russian forces under Kutuzov blocked the road in a fierce engagement. The battle raged through the town streets. Buildings changed hands multiple times. By the end of the day, both sides had suffered heavy casualties, but the strategic reality was clear. The southern route was blocked. Napoleon could either fight through Kutuzov's entire army, a general engagement he was no longer strong enough to win, or turn back to the devastated Smolensk highway. He turned back. The army that had advanced through prosperous villages in June now retreated through ash and ruin. Every village burned, every well poisoned or filled with debris, every barn emptied. The roads themselves, those primitive Russian tracks, had been churned into mud channels by the passage of hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of wagons during the advance. Now, in October, rains and early snow, those tracks became bottomless mires. The psychological state of the army began to shift. Adam Zamoyski, in his comprehensive study, 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow, describes this period as a Lord of the Flies scenario, where self-sacrifice and military discipline were replaced by a me or you survivalist mentality. The first signs appeared in small ways. Soldiers abandoning wounded comrades rather than helping them. Stronger men taking food from weaker. Units disintegrating as soldiers scattered to forage individually rather than maintaining formation. The army's composition was changing too. Soldiers were becoming stragglers. The difference between a soldier and a straggler was simple. A soldier maintained his place in formation, carried his weapon, obeyed orders. A straggler wandered, weaponless, desperate for food and shelter. no longer part of any military organization. By early November, the ratio was shifting. For every organized soldier, there were 2 stragglers. The Grande Armée was dissolving. The Cossacks sensed the weakness. These Russian irregular cavalry, superb horsemen armed with lances and sabers, began harassing the French columns constantly. They didn't engage in pitched battles. They struck isolated units, cut off stragglers, attacked supply wagons, then vanished into the forests before French cavalry could respond. Every day, hundreds of French soldiers simply disappeared, picked off by Cossacks, freezing to death in the night, dying from disease and exhaustion. Food became an obsession. The standard rations had long since run out. Soldiers ate their horses, first the ones that died naturally, then the ones they killed for meat. Accounts describe men drinking horse blood to ward off starvation. They ate bark. They fought over scraps of bread. The social contract that holds an army together, the understanding that we're all in this together, that we help each other, was breaking down. By early November, as temperatures dropped and food disappeared, the psychological state of the Grande Armée underwent a radical transformation. The first snowstorm was still days away, but the real winter, the winter of the human soul, had already begun. On November 6th, the first major snowstorm overtook the army. On November 6th, 1812, the first major snowstorm overtook the retreating army. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. _21_ had arrived. But historians emphasize a crucial point. The cold wasn't the primary killer. It was the lack of preparation for cold that any rational military planner should have anticipated. The immediate impact of the snowstorm was catastrophic for soldiers already weakened by months of marching, inadequate food, and disease. Their uniforms, designed for European campaigning, were inadequate for Russian winter. Wool jackets and trousers provided some insulation, but many soldiers had lost or traded parts of their uniforms during the retreat. The forbidden tents meant no shelter. Wet clothing from sweat or snow turned into what contemporary accounts called icy shrouds that molded to bodies and sucked away body heat. But the most visible failure was one of those small but vital details that doom armies: horseshoes. Napoleon's logistics corps had neglected to supply winter horseshoes with spikes for ice and snow. The standard smooth horseshoes caused horses to slip and fall on icy roads. A cavalry horse that falls can break legs. A draft horse that can't gain traction can't pull artillery or supply wagons. The result was mass death of the remaining horse population. Thousands of horses perished, some from falls, some from inability to pull loads leading to their abandonment. Most from the compound effect of cold, malnutrition, and disease. Without horses, the army lost the last vestiges of mobility. Artillery pieces were abandoned wholesale. Cavalry units became infantry, quote, 24, as the saying went. The army's offensive capability vanished. The human toll was equally severe, but in ways that were harder to quantify in the moment. Soldiers already weakened by typhus, paratyphoid fever, and relapsing fever, the diseases modern DNA analysis has identified in Vilnius mass graves, couldn't fight off hypothermia. Their immune systems compromised, their bodies undernourished, exposure to minus 30-degree temperatures was a death sentence. Contemporary memoirs describe the psychological horror with disturbing clarity. Soldiers ate horses that were still alive, cutting meat from the flanks of dying animals. There are harrowing reports, some from reliable witnesses, others from less certain sources, of soldiers eating the flesh of fallen comrades. Whether these reports are true or exaggerated, They reveal the mental state of an army that had completely abandoned normal human restraint. The breakdown of altruism, mercy, and compassion accelerated. Zamoyski's analysis, drawing from dozens of first-hand accounts, describes soldiers as shells of their former selves, both physically and psychologically preying on their comrades. A man who collapsed from exhaustion would be stripped of his coat and boots by those still walking, stripped while still alive, left to freeze. The code that soldiers lived by, never abandon your brothers, had shattered. Historians analyzing the campaign now emphasize that, with or without infectious diseases, they would have died massively anyway. But the pathogens identified through DNA analysis ensured almost no one escaped the spiral of horror. The combination was perfect for mass death. Infectious disease weakening immune systems, cold exposure destroying those already weakened, starvation removing any chance of recovery. The Grande Armée was disintegrating not from a single cause, but from catastrophic failure at every level. Logistics, medicine, leadership, and finally, humanity itself. The cold was simply the accelerant on a fire already burning. By late November, the shattered remnants of the army, numbering only 27,000 effective men and 40,000 stragglers, found themselves trapped against the Berezina River. By late November, the tattered remnants of the Grande Armée, 27,000 effective combatants and 40,000 stragglers, found themselves trapped against the Berezina River. A Russian pincer movement threatened to annihilate the entire force. Napoleon had no pontoon equipment. The bridge at Borisov had been destroyed. Across the continent, military planners began writing his obituary. The strategic situation was desperate. Admiral Pavel Chichagov commanded approximately 33,000 Russian troops on the western bank of the Berezina. General Peter Wittgenstein approached from the northeast with 28,000 men. Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov followed from the east with the main Russian army. 54,000 soldiers just 40 miles behind the French. Total Russian forces converging on the river. Over 115,000 fresh troops against a French force reduced to physical and psychological wreckage. The Berezina River itself was an obstacle that should have been manageable. In normal November conditions, it would be frozen solid. Armies could cross on the ice. But 1812 was not a normal year. The weather had been unusually warm for late November. The river had thawed. What should have been a frozen highway was now a 100-meter wide channel of swift current and floating ice chunks. The bridge at Borisov, the obvious crossing point, had been destroyed by the Russians days earlier. Napoleon's earlier decision to order the destruction of most of the army's pontoon equipment to lighten the load and speed the retreat now revealed itself as potentially fatal. Without bridging equipment, crossing was impossible. With the Russians closing from 3 directions, there was no time to search for fords elsewhere. The geographic reality trapped the French. To the east, Wittgenstein and Kutuzov. To the west, Chichagov. To the north and south, marshes and forests unsuitable for large-scale troop movement. The Berezina was the only practical route west toward safety, and it was impassable. Napoleon's force at this point was a mixture of desperation. The 27,000 effective soldiers still maintained some semblance of military discipline. They carried weapons, followed orders, belonged to organized units. The 40,000 stragglers were camp followers, wounded soldiers barely able to walk, wives who had followed their husbands to Russia, children born during the campaign, servants, merchants, refugees from every nation that had marched east, all trapped. Contemporary accounts describe the mood as apocalyptic. Soldiers who had survived Austerlitz, who had marched from Spain to Poland, who had believed themselves invincible under Napoleon's command, now faced what seemed like certain annihilation. The Russian noose was tightening. Winter was deepening. Food was gone. And before them, a river that could not be crossed. In this moment of apparently total catastrophe, one general's act of disobedience would determine whether Napoleon died in Russia or escaped to fight another day. That general was Jean-Baptiste Eblé, and the decision he'd made weeks earlier would save thousands of lives. Weeks earlier, Napoleon had ordered General Jean-Baptiste Eblé to destroy the Pontonniers' mobile forges and bridging equipment. The reasoning was logical. The equipment was heavy, required transport animals that were dying in droves, and would slow the retreat. Napoleon insisted the equipment be destroyed to prevent it from falling into Russian hands. Eblé argued they might need it. The emperor was adamant. Eblé quietly disobeyed and kept the vital equipment intact. That act of insubordination would save the army's remnant. When the Grande Armée reached the Berezina on November 25th, General Corbineau's scouts located a ford at Studianka, several kilometers north of Borisov. The ford was passable, barely, but it wasn't a bridge. Artillery, wagons, and the massive stragglers couldn't wade through swift current with floating ice. They needed bridges, and thanks to Eblé's disobedience, they had the tools to build them. Eblé commanded 400 pontonniers, bridge-building specialists, mostly Dutch and French, organized into companies from the 1st and 2nd Pontonnier battalions. According to French military records documented by historian Alexander Berezina, the pontonniers at the Berezina included the 2nd, 7th, and 9th companies of the 1st Battalion, and the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th companies of the 2nd Battalion. They had saved their forges, charcoal, and essential tools, hammers, nails, trestles. On the morning of November 26th, Eblé's engineers began work. The plan was to build 2 pontoon bridges, one for infantry and cavalry, one strong enough for artillery and wagons. The material source was the town of Studianka itself. The pontonniers dismantled houses, barns, anything wooden. When Studianka was exhausted, they dismantled the next village. Timber became trestles. Beams became bridge spans. The working conditions were beyond brutal. The water temperature was barely above freezing, cold enough that hypothermic death would occur in less than 30 minutes of full immersion. Philippe Paul de Ségur, who chronicled the campaign and witnessed the bridge construction, wrote that Pontonnier, quote, 28, quote, from the 400 pontonniers, over 100 men entered the water. They worked in rotation, shifts of minutes, not hours, because the human body cannot endure such cold for long. Standing chest deep in sub-zero water, they positioned wooden trestles on the riverbed, held them steady while beams were placed across the tops, secured the structure with whatever materials they had. Their hands went numb. Their bodies shook with hypothermic shivers. Some died in the water. Their hearts simply stopped. Others made it to shore, but succumbed to hypothermia on the banks. Contemporary accounts from multiple sources document the sacrifice with consistent horror. Quote, Cax Uhexa Berezina writes, carefully avoiding disputed exact figures. Various sources cite different numbers, quote 30, quote 31. But all agree the casualty rate among the pontonniers was catastrophic. Eblé himself, wearing waders and leading by example, entered the water repeatedly to supervise and encourage his men. He was 54 years old. The exertion and exposure would kill him. Just over a month later, on December 31st, 1812, General Jean-Baptiste Eblé died of exhaustion in Königsberg. Napoleon, unaware of his death, had appointed him Inspector General of Artillery in January to reward his service. When the emperor learned of Eblé's death, he ensured Eblé's widow was made a countess as tribute to the officer he could no longer reward. By the late afternoon of November 26th, 2 bridges spanned the Berezina. The infantry bridge was approximately 100 meters long. The artillery bridge, more robust to handle cannon weight, was slightly shorter but broader. The Dutch and French pontonniers had achieved what seemed impossible. But their sacrifice had only opened the door. Crossing would require one more miracle. Someone had to hold the Russians back, while tens of thousands of men, women, and children crossed. That task fell to 4 Swiss regiments, who would write their names in blood on the western bank. 4 Swiss infantry regiments, roughly 1,300 men from Marshal Oudinot's 2nd Corps, formed the rearguard on the Berezina's west bank. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Swiss regiments. Facing them, over 30,000 fresh Russian troops under Wittgenstein and Chichagov. By the battle's end, only 300 Swiss soldiers remained alive. The tactical situation required someone to hold the western bridgehead while the army crossed. As French cavalry and infantry streamed across the pontoon bridges, they needed time to form defensive positions on the far bank. Without a rearguard, the Russians would attack the bridges directly, causing chaos and slaughter at the crossing points. The Swiss drew the assignment. On November 28th, the full Russian assault began. Wittgenstein's forces attacked from the northeast. Chichagov, who had realized his error in moving south earlier and allowing the French to reach Studianka unmolested, threw his troops against the western perimeter. Over 30,000 Russians against 1,300 Swiss and scattered French units still organizing on the west bank. The combat lasted all day. Jean-Marc Bussy, a Swiss voltigeur who survived, recorded the experience in memoirs that became foundational to Swiss national memory. Quote, 32, he wrote. Quote, 33, the Swiss regiments, according to multiple battle accounts, made 7 bayonet charges during the fighting. They ran out of cartridges mid-battle. Without ammunition, they fixed bayonets and charged repeatedly into Russian positions to maintain the defensive line. Hand-to-hand combat in temperatures well below freezing. Bayonets thrust into bodies, muskets swung as clubs, men wrestling in the blood-soaked snow. The casualty mathematics were brutal. Starting with approximately 1,300 men, the 4 Swiss regiments lost over 1,000 in a single day. The sources are consistent across French, Swiss, and Russian accounts. Quote 34, not 300 in each regiment, 300 total. The battle is immortalized in the quote 35, a Swiss commemoration song that became a symbol of national sacrifice. General Merle, who commanded the division, told Napoleon he believed every Swiss soldier deserved the Legion of Honor for their actions at Berezina. Napoleon agreed and approved 62 crosses of the Legion of Honor for Swiss officers and men. The order was dispatched, and then lost in the chaos of the retreat and subsequent campaigns. The decorations were never awarded. The Swiss soldiers who survived received no medals, no official recognition from the French Empire they had saved. But Swiss national memory elevated them to heroes regardless of French recognition. In Switzerland, the Berezina crossing became a foundational myth. Proof that Swiss soldiers were among Europe's finest, that their sacrifice had saved Napoleon's army, that their courage deserved remembrance even if the French chose to forget. The Swiss regiments suffered stupendous casualties, but their sacrifice saved most of the French troops who crossed that day. Their heroic stand bought time measured in thousands of lives. French lives that would return home while the Swiss dead remained frozen in Russian soil. But not everyone made it across. And what happened on the morning of November 29th would make underscore quote underscore 36 underscore a French synonym for total. Disaster. On the morning of November 29th, as Russian forces drew near to complete their encirclement, Napoleon ordered the bridges burned. Thousands of camp followers, wives, children, and wounded soldiers who had spent the night by their campfires on the eastern bank, rather than crossing, immediately panicked and rushed for the burning planks. Eble had delayed as long as humanly possible. Contemporary accounts document his efforts to encourage stragglers to cross through the night of November 28th. Colonel Seruzier, one of Eble's officers, recorded, "We knew the Russians were getting close, but I could not get the drivers of the baggage, cantinière or the vivandière, to listen to reason. In vain, I told them everyone would be saved if only there was a little order, that their safety depended on crossing at once. But human nature betrayed them. Many stragglers refused to abandon the relative comfort of their campfires. They were exhausted, frozen, sick. The prospect of crossing in the dark, in the cold, seemed less appealing than waiting for morning. They would cross at dawn, they thought. Just a few more hours of rest. At 8:30 in the morning on November 29th, with Wittgenstein's advance elements approaching, Eble gave the order. The bridges must burn. If the Russians captured the bridges intact, they could pursue the French across the Berezina and complete the annihilation. The pontonniers set fire to the structures they had built at such terrible cost. The scene that followed was apocalyptic. Thousands of people on the eastern bank, estimates range from 10,000 to 30,000 total casualties at Berezina. Though the exact number abandoned at the burning is disputed, realized they were being left behind. They rushed for the bridges. The crush was immediate. People pushed into the icy water, unable to swim, drowning in the current. Others were trampled by the panic-stricken mass. Some reached the burning bridges and tried to cross anyway, walking on planks that collapsed beneath them, falling into the flames or the river. Wives of soldiers, children born during the campaign, wounded men who had managed to struggle this far but couldn't walk fast enough in the chaos, all abandoned. The arriving Cossacks showed little mercy. Those captured faced what Russian records and survivor accounts describe as murderous conditions at the hands of Cossacks and Russian partisans. Few survived Russian captivity. The term Berezina has since entered the French language as a synonym for disaster. Not just defeat, but catastrophic calamity marked by abandonment and despair. The linguistic legacy endures 2 centuries later. Yet from a strictly military perspective, the Berezina crossing was a tactical success. Napoleon escaped the trap. Between 27,000 and 40,000 soldiers crossed to relative safety on the western bank. The bridges had allowed the army's core to survive when annihilation seemed certain. But the cost in non-combatant lives, in human suffering, in moral stain, was horrific. The Battle of Berezina was both a tactical success and a human catastrophe, a victory whose name became synonymous with disaster. The remnant that crossed the Berezina continued west toward Vilnius and safety. But the horror wasn't over. The worst, in some ways, was yet to come. On December 5th, 1812, at Smorgoni, Napoleon departed from his army in a covered sled. He left command to Marshal Joachim Murat and Marshal Michel Ney and raced incognito through Poland and Germany back to Paris. The emperor was abandoning his men, but news from the capital demanded his immediate return. The Malais coup, which had occurred on October 23rd while Napoleon was still retreating from Moscow, had revealed a fundamental weakness in the French Empire. General Claude François de Mallet, an ardent Republican who had been confined to a sanatorium for mental instability, escaped and used forged documents claiming Napoleon had died in Russia. With these forgeries, Mallet convinced elements of the Paris National Guard that the emperor was dead and that a provisional government must be formed. For 6 hours on October 23rd, Mallet controlled key elements of the Paris garrison. He arrested several high-ranking ministers, including the Minister of Police. The coup was eventually suppressed by loyal troops, and Mallet was executed by firing squad on October 29th. But the episode deeply disturbed Napoleon when he received word of it in Russia. The crisis wasn't that Mallet had attempted a coup. Conspiracies were common in Napoleonic France. What shocked Napoleon was what didn't happen. No one in the government, military or National Guard, immediately proclaimed Napoleon II, the emperor's infant son, as the new emperor. The entire regime seemed to depend entirely on Napoleon's personal presence. The dynasty lacked institutional legitimacy. When people believed Napoleon was dead, they didn't automatically transfer loyalty to his heir. They questioned whether the empire itself would continue. This political vulnerability forced Napoleon's hand. He couldn't stay with the army. He needed to return to Paris immediately to shore up his political position, reassure the government, prevent further conspiracies. Marshal Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law and commander of the reserve cavalry, took nominal command of the retreat. Marshal Ney commanded the rearguard, a duty that would earn him immortal fame as the bravest of the brave. Before departing, Napoleon dictated the 29th Bulletin of the Grande Armée, dated December 3rd, 1812. This was the first official French government document to acknowledge the scale of the disaster to the public. The bulletin was a masterpiece of propaganda and selective truth. Napoleon blamed the catastrophe on weather. The document stated, "Up to the 6th of November, the weather had been perfect." This was technically true, but deliberately misleading. As we've documented, half the army had already been lost to heat, disease, and logistics failures before winter arrived. But Napoleon needed a scapegoat, and, quote, 42 was convenient. It absolved him of strategic responsibility. The bulletin concluded with a sentence that shocked Europe. Quote, 43. While 500,000 families across Europe mourned their dead sons, husbands, and fathers, the emperor wanted everyone to know he personally was in excellent health. Contemporary accounts describe the public reaction as outrage. This underscore, quote, underscore 44 underscore seemed to prioritize Napoleon's ego over acknowledging the human catastrophe. The 29th Bulletin had a profound effect across Europe. It shattered the myth of Napoleonic invincibility forever. As the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna of Russia observed, "He is no longer an idol, but has descended to the rank of men, and as such can be fought by men." Every nation, every ethnic group, every political faction with a dream of independence or revenge took heart from Napoleon's admission of disaster. Napoleon reached Paris and suppressed the conspiracy's aftermath. But the political damage was done. The military damage was catastrophic. While Napoleon maneuvered politically in Paris, his abandoned army faced its final ordeal on the frozen roads of Lithuania. Modern forensic and genomic studies of mass graves in Vilnius have revealed what killed Napoleon's army. It wasn't primarily combat. It wasn't even primarily cold. The major killers were microscopic, bacteria and parasites transmitted by body lice. The mass graves in Vilnius, Lithuania, contain the remains of thousands of soldiers who died during the retreat in late 1812. In recent decades, scientists have extracted DNA from skeletal remains and analyzed the preserved genetic material. The results, published in peer-reviewed medical and historical journals, provide unprecedented insight into the diseases that devastated the Grande Armée. The pathogens identified include Rickettsia prowazekii, the bacterium causing epidemic typhus, characterized by high fever, delirium, and organ failure. Salmonella enterica serovar paratyphi C, causing paratyphoid fever with severe digestive issues and debilitating fatigue. Borrelia recurrentis, causing relapsing fever with cycles of high temperature and temporary remission. Bartonella quintana, causing trench fever with leg pain, headaches, and recurring fever that chronically weakened victims. All 4 pathogens share a common vector: body lice. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the Grande Armée's staging areas and camps, lice spread rapidly. Soldiers couldn't bathe regularly. They wore the same clothes for weeks or months. Lice infested uniforms, nested in seams, laid eggs in fabric. When lice bite, they defecate. When soldiers scratch the bites, they rub the lice feces into the wound. The bacteria enter the bloodstream. The DNA evidence confirms what contemporary medical accounts suggested, but couldn't prove with certainty. French military surgeons documented that typhus decimated the ranks before a single major battle was fought. The disease began spreading in June, during the concentration near the Neman. By the time the army reached Moscow, typhus had killed tens of thousands. But the compound effect was what made the death toll so catastrophic. Soldiers already weakened by typhus or paratyphoid fever had compromised immune systems. When they were exposed to cold, their bodies couldn't maintain core temperature. Hypothermia killed them faster than it would have killed healthy men. When they couldn't eat enough food, their weakened systems couldn't recover. When they developed dysentery from contaminated water, their bodies, already fighting multiple infections, collapsed. Modern medical historians analyzing the evidence emphasize a crucial point. Quote, 47. The compound disaster of disease, cold, starvation, and exhaustion created conditions where each factor multiplied the lethality of the others. But the pathogens ensured that almost no one escaped the underscore. Quote, underscore 48, underscore. Even soldiers who avoided frostbite, who found food, who maintained morale. If they were infected with typhus or relapsing fever, they likely died. The timeline of death supports this analysis. The heaviest mortality occurred during the late November and December retreat through Lithuania, exactly when the combination of disease, cold, and starvation created perfect conditions for mass death. Bodies were buried in mass graves, sometimes hundreds together. The frozen ground preserved DNA for 2 centuries, allowing modern science to confirm what killed them. The Grande Armée was destroyed by an echeloned failure across tactical, operational, and strategic levels. Combat at Borodino and the Berezina claimed tens of thousands, but the majority succumbed to biological and environmental factors that rational planning should have anticipated, but hubris chose to ignore. The campaign's biological catastrophe had geopolitical consequences that would reshape Europe. As word of the disaster spread across Europe, the balance of power shifted with unprecedented speed. Napoleon's reputation for military invincibility, laboriously built over 2 decades of victories from Austerlitz to Wagram, was shattered. The Sixth Coalition formed almost overnight to exploit French weakness. Prussia, which had been a cowed and humiliated ally since Jena in 1806, was the first to defect. In early 1813, King Frederick William III secretly negotiated with Russia. On February 28, 1813, Prussia and Russia signed the Treaty of Kalisz, forming an alliance against France. The Prussian army, rebuilt in secret despite treaty limitations, was ready to fight. The Prussian people, who had endured French occupation and tribute payments, erupted in nationalistic fervor. Sweden joined the coalition next, under the remarkable leadership of Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's own former commanders. Bernadotte, having been elected Crown Prince of Sweden in 1810, chose Swedish interests over French loyalty. Sweden's participation secured the coalition's northern flank and provided experienced military leadership. Austria, technically still allied with France through the marriage of Napoleon's second wife, Marie-Louise, the daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I, maintained neutrality through the spring of 1813. But when it became clear that Napoleon could not restore his power, Austria joined the coalition in August. With Austrian participation, the coalition had overwhelming numbers. Britain, which had been fighting France continuously since 1803 with only one brief peace, provided the financial backbone. British gold subsidized Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish armies. The coalition had what Napoleon increasingly lacked: money, men, and industrial capacity. The military culmination came at Leipzig in October 1813. The Battle of the Nations, so called because it involved troops from Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and numerous German states against the French and their remaining allies, was the largest battle in European history up to that point. Over 500,000 soldiers participated. Napoleon fought brilliantly, but was overwhelmed by numbers. After 4 days of combat, the French retreated in disorder. Napoleon's control of Germany ended. By early 1814, coalition armies invaded France itself. Russian, Prussian, and Austrian forces crossed the Rhine and advanced toward Paris. Napoleon conducted a brilliant defensive campaign, the Campaign of France, with limited forces against overwhelming odds. But he couldn't overcome the strategic mathematics. On March 31st, 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. On April 6th, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. Russia emerged from the war as the primary land power in Europe. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Russian Emperor Alexander I sat at the table. As one of the architects of the new European order, Russia's dominance of continental European politics would last until the First World War destroyed the Russian, Austrian, and German empires a century later. The failure in Russia didn't just weaken Napoleon. It fundamentally altered European power dynamics. The continental system collapsed. French satellite states revolted. Polish dreams of independence were crushed again. At the Congress of Vienna, the victorious powers redrew the map of Europe to prevent any single nation from dominating the continent as France had done. But the 1812 campaign's impact extended beyond politics and treaties. It transformed how warfare itself was understood. The 1812 campaign transformed warfare from the professional armies and limited objectives of the 18th century into the total war and nationalistic conflicts that would define modern warfare. It wasn't just armies fighting. It was entire populations mobilized for national survival. The Russian response pioneered what would later be called total war. The scorched earth policy wasn't implemented by the army alone. It required civilian participation. Russian peasants burned their own crops and villages. They poisoned their own wells. They fled into forests rather than sell food to the invaders. The Orthodox Church framed the conflict as a holy war, mobilizing religious fervor. Cossack irregulars and partisan bands conducted guerrilla warfare, creating an environment where the French were denied even the ability to forage safely. This wasn't the limited warfare of the 18th century, where professional armies maneuvered for tactical advantage and civilians were largely spared. This was a nation choosing self-destruction over surrender. The burning of Moscow, Russia's spiritual capital, abandoned and destroyed rather than handed intact to Napoleon, symbolized a level of commitment that shocked European sensibilities. The campaign gave birth to Russian national mythology. In Russia, the conflict is called the Patriotic War of 1812. It became a foundational narrative of Russian identity, the defense of the motherland against foreign invasion. Leo Tolstoy's novel Quote 49, published in the 1860s, immortalized the campaign in literature. The narrative of sacrifice, of choosing destruction over submission, of ultimate victory despite terrible cost, became central to Russian self-understanding. The military lessons were studied intensively. Adam Zamoyski's Comprehensive History. 1812. Napoleon's fatal march on Moscow analyzes the campaign as the nemesis of overreaching power. Modern military academies still teach the campaign to illustrate fundamental principles. Logistics matter more than tactics. Geography and climate are strategic factors that cannot be overcome by genius alone. National will can defeat any invader, and hubris, the refusal to accept operational limitations, can transform victories into catastrophes. The parallels to Operation Barbarossa in 1941 are striking and frequently noted by historians. The German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union with similar assumptions. Superior tactical ability would overcome numerical disadvantages. The campaign could be completed before winter. The Soviet Union would collapse after early defeats. The results were eerily similar. Massive early victories followed by logistical breakdown. Winter warfare without proper preparation, partisan resistance, and ultimate strategic catastrophe. The cultural impact extended beyond Russia. French writers, including Honoré de Balzac and Victor Hugo, found inspiration in the campaign's tragic grandeur. The 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky, commissioned for the consecration of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, built to commemorate the victory, became one of the world's most recognized musical pieces. The 1812 campaign remains a definitive example of how geography, logistics, and national determination can defeat even the most brilliant military commander when strategic ambition exceeds operational capacity. It taught enduring lessons about the limits of military power and the dangers of hubris. These lessons were learned at terrible cost. Over 400,000 French and Allied dead, over 200,000 Russian military casualties, and uncounted civilian deaths. 685,000 men marched east in June. Fewer than 40,000 stumbled west in December. Between those two numbers lies one of history's most complete catastrophes and its most enduring lessons. 685,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in European history, crossed the Neman River on June 24, 1812. 6 months later, fewer than 40,000 stumbled back across that same river. A 94% casualty rate. Over 400,000 dead. Multiple historians analyzing different sources agree. This was annihilation. The myth says Russian winter destroyed Napoleon's army. The reality, documented through contemporary accounts and modern scientific analysis, is more complex and more instructive. Half the army died before winter arrived, killed by heat, disease, and logistics collapse during the summer advance. The first major snowstorm came November 6th. By then, 2/3 of the soldiers were already gone. Modern DNA evidence from Vilnius mass graves proves that lice-borne typhus, paratyphoid fever, and relapsing fever killed more men than Russian bullets or French artillery. Think about what was lost. Not just soldiers, but 20 nations worth of young men. Poles who believed they were fighting for national restoration, their independent state crushed again at the Congress of Vienna. Germans pressed into service by defeated princes. Dutch engineers who waded into sub-zero water at the Berezina, knowing they would die so others could escape. 400 pontonniers, over 100 entering the killing water. Only a small number surviving. Swiss regiments reduced from 1,300 to 300 in a single day at the Berezina, holding a bridgehead so Napoleon's army could cross. Their sacrifice bought time measured in thousands of lives. Napoleon made brilliant tactical decisions at the operational level. His marshals, Davout, Ney, Murat, Borodino, were among history's finest military commanders. But strategically, Napoleon committed catastrophic errors documented in primary sources. Forbidding tents to maintain marching speed, ordering bridging equipment destroyed, remaining in Moscow's ruins for 35 days while winter approached, neglecting winter horseshoes and appropriate footwear. Small details. Fatal consequences. The geopolitical transformation was immediate and permanent. Within 18 months, Paris fell to coalition forces. Napoleon abdicated in April 1814. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Russia emerged as the dominant continental power, a position it would hold until the First World War. The map of Europe was redrawn. The age of French dominance ended. The continental system, Napoleon's economic weapon against Britain, collapsed completely. Military historians still study the 1812 campaign because it demonstrates fundamental truths that transcend technology and tactics. Logistics matter more than battlefield brilliance. Geography and climate are strategic factors that genius cannot overcome. National will, the Russian resolution to burn their own cities rather than surrender, can defeat any invader. And hubris, the refusal to accept operational limitations, can transform what looks like inevitable victory into catastrophic defeat. The comparison to Operation Barbarossa is impossible to avoid. In June 1941, the German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union, following almost the same routes Napoleon had taken 129 years earlier. The Wehrmacht was technologically superior, tactically brilliant, and initially overwhelmingly successful. They assumed they could complete the campaign before winter. They didn't prepare for winter warfare. They underestimated Soviet will to resist. The results were remarkably similar. Early victories, logistical collapse, winter catastrophe, partisan resistance, strategic defeat. On December 3, 1812, Napoleon dictated the 29th Bulletin acknowledging the scale of disaster. He blamed the weather. He claimed, in the document's final sentence, that shocked Europe. Quote, 52. While 500,000 families across Europe mourned their dead. The emperor was concerned primarily with his own image and political survival. That single sentence revealed more about Napoleon's character than volumes of biography. General Jean-Baptiste Eblé, who saved the army's remnant by disobeying Napoleon's order to destroy bridging equipment, died of exhaustion on December 31st, 1812, less than 2 months after supervising the Berezina crossing. The 400 pontonniers who built those bridges in sub-zero water understood they were likely dying to save an army that would barely remember them. The Swiss soldiers who held the western bank understood their casualty rate would exceed 75%. They fought anyway. The sacrifice of common soldiers, not the genius of the emperor, is what allowed even the remnant to survive. The battlefield today? The Berezina crossing site near Studianka, Belarus, has a monument commemorating the battle. Vilnius holds memorial sites for the mass graves where modern DNA analysis continues to extract historical truth from skeletal remains. The route of the Grande Armée's retreat can still be traced through Lithuania, Belarus, and Western Russia, a trail of memory and mass graves stretching hundreds of miles. In the frozen marshes and burning cities of Russia, an empire learned that some things cannot be conquered, only survived at a cost that makes victory indistinguishable from defeat. The Grande Armée marched east as the largest military force in history. It returned as a ghost story that still haunts military planners 2 centuries later. Adam Zamoyski calls it the nemesis of overreaching power. The lesson remains relevant. Supply lines, realistic timelines, and achievable political objectives matter more than short-term battlefield gains. 685,000 to 40,000. June to December, the march that never came back.